how do you see big data being used in healthcare in the future?
Yeah, I mean, in many different ways, and people vary a lot about what they think is what they consider to be big data. So in a lot of instances, people primarily think about it as data that's big in volume. But I think importantly for healthcare, it's not just about volume, but it's also about data that are um, complex. And so one of the things that comes up is what's kind of health services research, which can be using large volumes of well-structured data. And while that might be large, I don't consider it big data, or and people typically don't use data science methods to analyze the data. So what ends up being kind of big data in health is when you're really bringing in multiple data streams, some of which might be well structured, such as in the structured fields of the electronic health record or from surveys, but we also think about data that are more unstructured, and thinking about the kinds of things that people might be collecting through personally held devices, or could come in from smart homes that would have sensors in them and those kinds of things. So
So I was kind of thinking of big data as where if we feel like looked at a code and you could look at all the different labs and stuff. Is that how it is? So if you could say, of all of these people who had a respiratory related event, all of them had these similar characteristics based on these labs, or that like,
I would not call that big data or data science.
okay.
That's straight descriptive types of stuff. Anytime you're working with coded data, regardless of volume, that's been carefully curated and coded, for the most part, I don't think about that as being big data, because it doesn't meet the criteria of being complex or being data that has high velocity, such as data that you would get coming out of physiological monitors, or those kinds of things. And it's not that, and I'm not saying that those analyses are not important to do. Health services research is very important, but it's not data science. Big data we do in our research, like in our group at Columbia Nursing. One area tends to be around looking more at social media, and particularly we've done a lot of work in studying Twitter in the area of dementia caregiving, and that we look at both the content and structure of tweets. And this is like millions of tweets. For us, that's been very much focusing on information visualization. And so that's what we've declared as our area. And we do a lot of work in information visualization, both from communicating kind of complex information to individual patients, to doing visualizations of organizations or public health systems and those kinds of things.
Social media companies, that involves getting permission, and how difficult is that? How complicated?
It doesn't, for most social media companies, it doesn't require getting permission.
Oh, okay.
Most typically, so things that are in social media are not protected health information, so there's no PHI HIPAA aspect of it. And for the most part, when we click those terms of agreement, we agree that our data is public. And so that's absolutely true for Twitter. And so Twitter provides a daily, every day they provide a set of tweets that it's possible to retrieve for analysis.
Concerns about that in the context of vulnerable populations and what they're,
Yeah. And so, yes, I've written about that a number of times. So the paper that Nancy Ream and I have in the annual review of nursing research is about the role of it's about data science in symptom management, and that particular paper has a whole section that's focused on the ethics
Mhm.
on the ethics of big data. And when we get to so when we get to the issue that you raised and the vulnerable populations, it really is an issue of beneficence,
Mhm.
because you have people who are benefiting from your data and who are possibly monetizing it because of what they're doing for it, and they could be turning it into commercial value, and yet you, the data generator, aren't getting any of that benefit of it. Yeah. Do with getting SNOMED into the Unified Medical Language System, and also towards its work as an international standard. But I also ended up leading some work on behalf of the International Council of Nurses and the International Medical Informatics Association Nursing Informatics Working Group. And we did a project to do a international standard, ISO standard, focus on nursing concept representation. And so ISO standards don't have, and these were creating reference terminology models for both diagnoses and interventions. And while ISO standards don't necessarily have, some ISO standards don't have a huge policy impact in the US, but they have a huge policy impact in the European Union. If there's an ISO standard, they have to use it. And so that's an example of something where early on, when there would be that that kind of policy impact. Things I'm doing, like an example of something that's is likely to have policy impact, and we're still kind of in the midst of it at the moment. So there's been different things along the way that have had policy impact. There was one other thing in terminology, like I can't remember, it was something for reimbursement, and you used to be required to use CPT codes for it, which are something that you have to buy from the American Medical Association. And through a project that I had one of my PhD students do, we showed that you could use LOINC to do the same kind of thing, and that ended up changing federal policy. So you were able to use the free LOINC codes instead of the CPT codes to do this type of quality measurement. And so that was an example of something kind of very small that probably ended up making a big difference in something. Now, the thing that we're doing now that is influencing some policy already and may have more policy implications down the road is, for the last, gosh, it's probably 6 years now, I've done work related on returning research results to patients who generated the data. And so when we first started this with our first project, we were doing a project called WISER, which included doing a community survey of almost 6,000 Latinos as part of the project. And one of the things I decided to do in that project was to figure out how to give data back to the community in a way that they could understand it and that it would be actionable for their self-management, as well as for use of the community to possibly do some community decision-making. And so we did participatory design to come up with some different types of designs for things that were, there's blood pressure, there's BMI, there's physical activity. A lot of it was around some symptoms, how their symptoms might compare to someone else, their overall health status and stuff. And then we created some software to create these visualizations at scale, so you could give tailored results back to patients. And so that work has ended up, so that was kind of the work. And then what happened next with anyway, we're continuing that work with different types of populations and different types of visualizations. But one of the things that led to was me being appointed to a committee at the National Academy of Medicine that is, a committee is called, and these are consensus committees that used to be called IOM committees, and now they're called National Academy of Medicine committees. But anyway, the basic idea behind this particular committee, it is focused on returning individual laboratory results to patients, to research participants. Of course, you would return them to patients. But currently there's a lot of variation. There's conflicts in CMS and HIPAA. So anyway, this was a consensus study funded by the All of Us Precision Medicine Initiative, in which they're planning to give individual laboratory results back to patients, in addition to all kinds of other laboratory results, as well as CMS and then the FDA, because these people all have a piece in the game of both laboratory quality, the funding of laboratory results, and then in thinking about giving laboratory results back to research participants rather than patients. And one of the issues that we're dealing with in our report is when the results are processed in a research laboratory instead of a CLIA certified laboratory, which is required by CMS. So anyway, so our work in results reporting ended up getting involved in this process, which is going to have a set of recommendations that will likely broadly influence returning research results. Mm-hmm. So that's a long story down the road. I can't say too much about it because we're nearing the end of report, and it's embargoed, mm-hmm. But it'll be out in July. But that's an example of starting with something that's an area of research, and then it's not necessarily like it was one-to-one where I did this research and then it automatically changed policy. Mm-hmm. It was like I did this research, I had the opportunity to give some input to all of us at some workshops as well, but I also was able to get selected to go on this committee. And between those series of actions, I believe our work will ultimately have a policy influence.
Mm-hmm. And so is the question, how do the research subjects interpret the results, or how do they use the results to better their health?
Yeah, for us, it's where as an informatics and somebody who's research in informatics and data science, particularly information visualizations, for us, it's how do we develop information visualizations that are comprehensible and actionable. Mm-hmm. And so it was that kind of approach, and those are the same kinds of things that all of us is wanting to do. And for us, because we were primarily working with low SES Latino populations, often we're dealing with issues of limited health literacy and limited numeracy, and that's why we've gone with the information visualization
Mhm.
approach rather than doing something that would be more purely text.
Right. Yeah, we were watching a video of you giving a talk at the National Institute of Nursing Research talking about infographics and
Yeah, yeah, probably from one of the NINR big boot camps. Yeah, I've
Mhm.
spoken there a few times. Yeah. Yeah, people are still, I talk on that topic a lot. That's the, like my go-to talk at this point in my career, the one that everybody seems to want is
Mhm.
kind of advancing nursing science and health equity in the era of big data and precision medicine. So it's a theme that's still meaningful as different schools of nursing are trying to figure out how they're gonna deal with this.
Um, what opportunities do you see for nursing researchers in informatics and technology? So what do you see for us in the future as researchers?
I mean the opportunity the opportunities are pretty much without boundaries, and so I don't know that when I look at the uh, well, when I think about it from the perspective of the product of what I'm involved with, and so what I say in our program, like what we produce is nurse scientists who conduct interdisciplinary informatics research. And people have had a whole range of opportunities. Some people going to industry, some people going to practice organizations, some people doing um, a traditional academic position like mine, which would have teaching and research and professional service built into it. And so that's not going to go away anytime soon. For us, we have evolved to incorporate both in our center of excellence, but also in the training program that I direct. We've evolved to not only include informatics, but also to include data science.
What have been the biggest challenges in your career as a scientist?
Yeah, it's really been a very blessed career um, that has had uh, many opportunities. So I think often the challenges are just um, making decisions around the choices,
Mhm.
and of course, it's always thinking about the time. Um, Time management is challenging because, of course, there's lots of multitasking and that kind of thing. Um, for me, I funding, something like research funding has not been an issue for me. I have been very successful in being able to um, attract funding to support the program of research for the last 30 years, I guess, almost 30 years. So, and so it's and so I really can't say that it's been hard work,
Mm.
but uh, I when I think of there's other things that I would consider to be more challenging than something like that.
Great.
So, um, and Sunmu Yoon is one of our data scientists that leads those types of things. And then Jackie Merrill, who's another faculty member, she looks at more, she uses different types of clinical data, a variety of clinical sources, some of which are quite well structured, but she uses um, data science analytic methods to look at those data. So she specifically uses primarily methods that come from organizational network analyses. And what she does is she looks at pathways of patients through the system and uses different types of approaches to help figure out what are the optimal pathways for a patient journey through a system, basically. So there's all kinds of interesting things that can be done, and there's a number of nurses now who are doing different types of analyses in this field. And when I talk about it and its relevance to nursing, the suggestion that I actually make for schools of nursing is that they pick up, instead of trying to be broadly expert in data science, that they find an area to focus on and just develop excellence in a particular area. And for